Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're excited for this conversation. To see some known names and some new names and faces. Gonna give another couple of minutes and we'll start. I invite you to sit comfortably, get maybe a glass of water or a tea to enjoy informal conversation that hopefully will bring you some new insight, food for thought. Maybe will trigger you. Let's see. Hi, for those that are arriving, just giving another minute for people to arrive. In the meantime, we'd love to know who you are, where are you at the moment, and if you're part of any organization, please type on the chat. I know between the speakers, we're all spread, so I wonder where else are we in the world? So before we dive in, welcome again for those who are arriving. Hope you find a comfortable spot to sit, to have a nice, gentle, inspiring, triggering conversation and all of the above and more. We usually like starting our conversations with a brief kind of grounding. So if you're comfortable closing your eyes, I just invite you to give 3 deep breaths. You want to mute yourself and do a sound on your exhale is always releasing. So close your camera if you prefer, and I'll call you in a second. Whenever you're ready, you can open your eyes. And warm welcome to all of you to this conversation about flowing money in service of life, moving beyond an awareness. We're here with lots of friends and partners that we've been doing quite a few things together. And I'm going to hand over to Ruth, who's going to be hosting this conversation today, introducing our guest.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're calling. It's great because I see lots of friends in the in our collective space here today for the next hour and a half. I'd actually would like to start. We have quite a packed agenda today, but also with enough time for moving the conversation a little bit deeper, because this is a topic that I think can touch us a little bit deeper than, you know, when we're talking about philanthropy or when we're doing our day-to-day work. So I'd like to actually start with a little introduction. So I'm Ruth Andrade, and I work for Lush Cosmetics, both in their giving strategy and their environmental strategy. And I'm also part of Regenerosity, and we are one of the co-hosts of this webinar. But I'd actually wanted to start by inviting our super special guests so they can introduce themselves and their organizations. I'd like to start with Lynn and Al-Noor. If you can introduce yourselves and then also talk about Transition Resource. Share with us a little bit who you are and why I invited you. Faith, can you spotlight them, please?
Al-Noor, do you want to start?
No, you please go ahead.
Hello, all, and greetings to those familiar faces that I may not have seen in a long time and new people here. Greetings from where I'm sitting right now next to the Talamanca Mountains in a place called Chiripo in Central America, land of the Cabacar people. And my name is Lynn Murphy, and Al-Noor and I co-direct something called the Transition Resource Circle, which we can introduce in a moment. And I was a former senior fellow and program officer at the Hewlett Foundation now many years ago, and since then have been engaged as you could say in the world of philanthropy as a strategic advisor, but it feels more like an accompanier of different foundations and different initiatives across the global majority, the geopolitical South. And it's an honor to be here with you today.
Great.
Thanks, Lynn. Hi, everyone. My name is Al-Noor. My background is as an activist, a community organizer, a strategist, a writer. I have been working with social movements for the last 20 years, mostly peasant movements, farmer movements, indigenous movements in the global South, but also was part of the anti-globalization movement in Turtle Island and Occupy Wall Street and others. And my relationship with philanthropy is also quite fraught, I think, as probably many people on this call. And I went from, an activist organizer having to fundraise to working with funders and moving from this kind of journey of, I guess you would say, disdain to sympathy to empathy and now to accompaniment. And happy to be with all of you here today.
Great. And you have written a super beautiful and I think transformative book called Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, also as part of the work of the Transition Resource Circle. So do you just want to share with us briefly what the Transition Resource Circle is?
Lynn, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. What I didn't say when I introduced myself is that I resigned from a formal philanthropic position now about a decade ago. And it kind of in the realm of a conscientious objector, because I was sitting at the confluence of a sector I was working on that I saw the devastating effects of the colonial legacy embroiled in the international development system, and working at a technical rational institution, philanthropic institution, as a white woman sitting in Turtle Island, making decisions about what was happening in the geopolitical South. And so all of these things had very deep ethical and contradictory implications. And the work of Transition Resource Circle, I say that on a personal level, is one way that we're trying to respond to these contradictions, which is transition. How do we transition ourselves from systems of domination and exploitation to ones that are honor and are in right relationship with life in these moments? The resources is a call of how do we use capital to liberate capital in this short time that we have that it actually has value, so to speak, and to move us towards what Alnor and I will talk about as post-capitalist realities. And circle, how do we get out of hierarchical, kind of human-centric ways of doing this? How do we do these in ancient emerging ways, circle ways, to guide us in these times? And so Transition Resource Circle is work where we work with funders and funder activists and other allies in ways that we can move capital to be in service of life. And Alnor can fill in what I didn't say, and that work, both the gatherings and other provocations of that work, led to this book that Ruth mentioned.
No, I think that's great. I know we have a tight agenda, so we can keep moving.
Great. So, and then we have another guest, which I think represents one of these funders that are already walking a more progressive path, which is Seth. Would you like to introduce yourself and the work of Be the Earth?
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. My name is Seth Tabatsnik, and I am the funder and co-founder of Be the Earth Foundation. We really talk about our work being supporting economic systems that prioritize life ahead of profit, as opposed to the capitalist system, which prioritizes profit maximization. And we talk about systems, economic systems, as opposed to one system, because nature works in a decentralized way, and we don't believe that there is one system or one economy that holds all of the solutions. A lot of our work is really around combining impact investing and philanthropy, as well as other forms of capital, seeing them as different financial tools, as opposed to what I often refer to as financial schizophrenia, trying to profit maximize on the one hand and then give money away with the other. So really our work is combining not only the financial capital, but all forms of capital, including our time, our networks, political influence, but we can get into that later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Seth. That's really, really great. And then also, just to complete our introductions, part of this webinar is from a collaboration between Regenerosity and Be the Earth and other funders in what we call a community of practice. So Faith, if you want to explain Regenerosity briefly to us, and then I'll ask Renata to explain our community of practice, and then we go into the juicy part of this webinar.
Thank you, Ruth. So as Ruth said, Regenerosity is a partner with Be the Earth, and we work at our roots with grassroots organizations to help catalyze their work and their capacity. And we also work with funders through our funder circle and through many other ways to help them and help us find and fund these organizations that are really doing the work that needs to be done in the world. And we do this through a number of different ways, through peer learning circles, through catalyzing the growth and impact of these organizations, and then also through storytelling. So at the root of everything we do is really about the story and understanding the story of what's really happening and understanding the change.
Thank you. And Renata? Renata is right next to me. So yeah, we need to make sure we mute ourselves correctly in time.
Oh, and can you highlight your videos, your spotlights?
Yeah.
Faith,
can you spotlight Renata?
sorry, I realized I was chatting to you and didn't introduce myself. I'm Renata. I'm also part of Be the Earth, and I'm director of the programs in the foundation, and one of the kind of hybrid program / network that we co-host with Regenerosity is the Funders Community of Practice. So it started in a very practical exploration of how can we do more of trust-based philanthropy, less bureaucratized relationship with our grantees, and make everyone's life a bit easier. So changing how we do due diligence, the contract and templates, and then it evolved to kind of deeper inquiries, themes of interest. We ended up doing a few in-person events, working groups, but we kind of got to this moment where we're very interested in exploring all the different forms of capital, as Seth said, but also like what we've been calling the wholesome capital. So how can we move towards this coherence that some people are doing amazing philanthropy work and then doing the opposite on their investment, but how can we kind of put that all in the same vision, and what's really hard to do this move towards this direction we want to go. So we've been going for almost 2.5 years, and yeah, in the end we have a special invite from the community of practice to you. So I'll stop for now. Thanks.
Thank you. So let's briefly run through our agenda. Renata will show a slide. I think we've already started with introductions, because also the whole point about the community of practice is also to form community. So we always use a little bit of time in the webinar to do breakout groups so people can spontaneously meet each other, and also, you know, start building the connection between the different nodes of this network. Then we're going to start getting deeper into this topic. What do we mean by flowing money in service of life, and that combination between awareness and practice, and that dance of awareness and practice. We will go deeper into the contradictions and the paradoxes of philanthropy at the moment, and how can the frameworks that Lynn and Al-Noor have put together help us move through some of those contradictions. Yeah, and go into some juicy topics. Yeah, and that's it. And then we're going to finish with how can we bring this into our practice, and then add with a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please write them down, and we'll have a nice space at the end to ask questions. Right, let's move into this. So I think it's important when we talk about flowing money in service of life to qualify what we mean, both by moving money in the service of life, even though I think everyone in their introduction touched already a bit of that topic, and then this dance between awareness and practice. So just to begin, I think it was really interesting, like to be honest, the preparation for this webinar, there has been so much learning already. Like Renata and I started, no, let's talk about tax, investment, and philanthropy. And then we had a first meeting with Lynn, and we're like, oh, actually, this is like, again, breaking into parts rather than seeing things as whole, right? Rather than seeing this as how capital and money flows in our society, and how can we take a very holistic look into this. So yeah, I think it's important that even if we're, like, I consider myself to be very progressive in our thinking, and when I'm talking to people that have done, you know, even more reflection on this, I always feel that I'm pulled into, you know, a bigger perspective. So that's where I wanted to start. So I think from my own perspective, we're at a point now where we have really put life at risk, and we're going through what is called the Great Unraveling. And unless we align everything that we do, just our economies and our cultures and our relationships and our food systems in service of life, like there is no other way, right? We're really starting to put the depths, I was having a conversation over lunch now that with the thing that scared me most in the last weeks was what's happening to the seas and the rising sea temperatures that is actually affecting the diatoms, which is the very base of life on the planet. So for me, being service of life now is rethinking all our human interventions to align to this co-creation and support of life systems on the planet. And money is so powerful at the moment, and we've been doing the exact opposite. So what does it mean to start putting money in service of our future, in service of life? And then beyond the thing about awareness as well, and Renata and I also had some great conversations while we were preparing, it's this idea that it feels sometimes we're going in circles, but the dance between, right, let's go into awareness, but that also transform that awareness into what we're doing with our organizations. And let's start putting things into practice, because then when we're in relationship and in practice, we gain new levels of awareness that allows us to spiral upwards. Yeah, and Lynn, I know we talked about this at the preparation when we were preparing the webinar, so I'd love to hear your thoughts, you and Alnur, and the interpretation for, the moving money in service of life and moving beyond awareness.
Thanks, Ruth. I'll just add a couple of reflections here when we were speaking about this, which is that in our everyday way that we think about this topic of awareness into action, we live in a culture and in a time, it feels like that we consume information, that information has become yet one more area that we're just in constant, I would say, like almost malnourished and yet like obese at the same time, like consuming, taking in more and more. And then we get obsessed with how we're doing, what we're doing, what's the action. And we all involved in the NGO philanthropic industrial complex know that there's tons of grant making efforts to more awareness, more information, leading to action, or an emphasis on the action as developing the next global commitment or discourse or whatever it is. And what I feel like what we're trying to invoke as a provocation today is that this move of awareness into action starts to come from a place of what's the shift of our state of being? What is it within not just an individualized separate self, but what is it in this being, in this body, mind, soul complex that is inextricably linked with the more than human, with all the human, with all the cultures and the institutions. If we take it from another place with what Alnur and I will often call ontological shifts, going back to first principles, the way that we perceive reality itself, and we start with a shift of that state of being, maybe we're starting on a different path, a different alchemical change that we can start to listen rather than determine from often an overly stimulated, what we think of a very highly rational neocortex, but maybe from that place, from a more humble, quieter place, we can listen for what is the actual shift in awareness, and then what is ours to do in a way of being, and a way of doing. So that's a first pass at a provocation, and we'll continue to deepen into this as we go.
Thank
Alnur,
you.
I don't know if
Alnur, yeah,
wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, maybe just explaining this word ontology that Lynn used. So ontology comes from the Greek onto, which is sometimes defined as to see, like vision, and also the beingness of the world. So part of the provocation of the book is to say not to do action, but to do it from a place of self-reflection, to do it from a place of cultural reflection. And we often say, in order to be contextually relevant, you have to be contextually sensitive. And that requires also internal dialogue, but also dialogue with the living planet, the ecology, the community of beings, human and otherwise, that we're entangled with. And similar to the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, action, non-action. It's not to not do anything or stop doing what we're doing, but doing it from a different quality of thought. So if we try to replicate our lens of separation, materialism, and rationalism, the unholy trinity of capitalist modernity, we end up creating 10 more problems for every solution we put on the table. And so how do we move to a state of, let's say, relationality instead of rationalism, animism instead of materialism, and interbeing instead of separation? And it's not that those things are going to go away, because that's the structure and the source code of the dominant culture, but there's a way to both dissect and analyze them and understand them and situate yourself within them, and then create and live and embody these new ancient emerging values.
Thank you. And this is a constant reminder to myself, to be honest. This weekend, I reflected a lot about, I always keep saying I need to stop doing incremental work and start doing transformative work. But to do transformative work, you really need to transform. There is a lot that needs to be transformed internally before the work is truly transformative. So we'll go a little bit deeper into how we do this and how can we move from awareness in ways that are really aligned to what we want to support in the world. But first, before we go deeper, I'd love for us to have a little conversation. And as I said before, for people to get to know each other and to give your own interpretation of those topics. Oh, I'll go back. Seth, before I move, do you want to say anything about how do you, because you also mentioned the economies in the service of life, and I'd love to hear your definition.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that came up as Lynn and Alnor was speaking was just bringing the voice of nature into the space, within the boardroom. It's, these conversations that have deep impact on how we function as a society, including this one. We're all in a room, we're all staring at a screen. Where is the voice of nature? How are we really bringing that into the conversation? And a very short story comes to me. About 3 months ago, I was meant to give a talk at a conference focused on impact investing and talking about my story. And the morning of the talk, I woke up, my voice was completely gone. I couldn't make a sound. So I kind of let the organizers know, I'm really sorry, like on text. Being at a conference was quite strange, not being able to speak to anyone, but really just sitting and listening. And I had a moment, I went outside halfway through the day and I sat under a tree and I got this download from the tree, which basically told me I had to be silent so that I would be still and listen. And the tree told me that the voice of nature was not present within the space. And if we're really going to shift things, nature needs its voice, and it's always whispering, and that we don't want to hear nature shout. And that was the message that I then gave to the group the next day when my voice came back. And it didn't feel like it was me giving that message. It really came from another place. And I guess the question I would ask is, what is the work we're doing inside ourselves to really align with the message that is always available to us through nature, and creating that space internally so that we can bring that voice into every space that we're within, whether that's indoors or outdoors, whether that's online, offline. We're not separate from nature, but we've disconnected ourselves by not listening more deeply. So that's what I would just share with, on that point.
That's great. Thank you, Seth. Yeah, I hear you. It was really great as well. I had a meeting. We went to see an Indigenous elder with a group of funders, and we were actually discussing actively about, how do we resource ourselves by connecting to nature and really being present and listening. So I'm glad that this is, a conversation that is spreading a little bit as well. So thank you for bringing this. Right. So we wanted to do a breakout for everyone to do a check-in, introduce yourselves, and then we have a couple of questions that have to do with the topic today. The first question is, what does it mean to flow money in service to life to you and to your context and to your own interpretation at the moment? And I also saw in the chat, lots of people here are from foundations or connected to the regenerative movement. And the second is, in this idea of transforming awareness into practice, and awareness that comes from a deeper knowing and a deeper connection, what is something that you recently became aware of that came either through self-reflection or through engaging or through deep listening? And did this translate into any change? So yeah, just like in the last 2 years, 2.5 years doing this community of practice with other funders, wow, like it's been a journey of increasing my awareness as well. And I can see how that is translating to change. So I'd love for you to share those stories with each other in a breakout room. So we're only going to have 7 minutes. It's, a couple of minutes per person. Brief intro. What does it mean to flow service, to flow money in service of life to you? And what is something that you have become aware recently in relation to the theme of money in service of life? And that has this translated into any changes in your place of work or your or your personal life, but in how you relate to money. Right. Faith, can you put it's never enough time. Oh well. I hope you at least got to meet new people. I was in a working group where we almost all knew each other. It was really fun. By total, I mean, we knew of each other, but no. And I, in my working group, I was with an amazing funder called Lunkily Chase, the organization that have been doing this work with Alnur and Lynn as well. And yeah, really revolutionary philanthropic work. Very good. Thank you so much for sharing. How was it for everyone? Yeah, did you manage to chat? Right, so I'll go back to, let me pull back the agenda. I lost it. Give me a moment. So we're going to keep deepening this conversation. And again, talking to our guests. I also want to hear, I think before we go deeper into a framework, I wanted to hear, starting from Seth and also from Lynn and Alnur, like, first, what process do you use for doing the work that you do, like for creating this inner awareness? Like, what is the actual practice that you do? And second, how has this transformed your work? So I'd love to hear some stories of what you have been, doing in practice to move the field around the topic of flowing money in service of life. So Seth, can I start with you? Like, because also you're, representing a wealth holder in this webinar. And I think it's, it's really important to, when we meet wealth holders that are doing the inner work and the inner practice of raising awareness, but then great to hear what are some like practical examples of how you've been putting that into work.
Great. So a couple of very different things come to mind. So in terms of the inner work, I guess the first thing that comes to me is within myself and within the team, like practices that we do. And we all complain, unfortunately, that we spend time on Zoom and not enough time in real life. So we've been doing things to change that, including just getting out onto the land. And I always say that actually Be the Earth as an organization was really born by having time and space in my own life, and essentially doing nothing, and just felt this calling when space was available to show and guide what needed to happen in terms of where I did put my energy more intentionally. And remember playing music in the forest, didn't know what the name was, what the entity was that was going to be born, and just singing just got this name, Be the Earth, that came through, and it became so much clearer what needed to happen. And all of our programs that we've run have really come from myself and Hanata going for hikes out in nature, and just having breakthrough moments, just not planning anything, but just being outside. And last week we had a team meeting, and I just said the most important thing we do over this 2 days is spend 2 hours together at least outside around the fire, in a circle, using the ancient technology of circles that we've used for thousands and thousands of years as a social technology, and being outside around the fire to set intentions, to offer our gratitude to the land, because none of us would be here without it. So, I mean, that's an internal practice. And then I guess externally, what it looks like is, I spoke to it a little bit earlier about financial schizophrenia, and just this idea of saying, what is the ultimate vision that we're trying to serve, and how are we bringing all our resources together? So it started in my own life of seeing my family kind of foundation called the Bertha Foundation, doing amazing work on human rights. And then the investment strategy was one of more of a profit maximizing type strategy. And I had an example where I sat in a boardroom and saw a film we were funding on the Amazon, and also knowing that we were we had bonds being given to the same company that we were fighting, that we had invested in. So that was really my kind of journey to saying, how can I move money in the direction of alignment with what the foundation was doing, and eventually then setting up our own foundation, which kind of brought it all under one single vision, as opposed to just trying to make them work. It was just saying, look, it's one vision and two different financial tools, and often everything in between.
Seth, can I just quickly ask, can you give some examples of the investments you've been doing? They're a little bit more aligned with the vision, just to also give people, what does that look like in the real world?
Yeah, sure. So maybe I'll just speak to most recently what we've been doing and why. So most of our most recent investments generally around food systems, and we've been doing revenue-based loans. The reason is that previously most of our investments were equity type investments, which had the old kind of investment requirement, which is an investment requirement when you're making an investment to somehow get money back at some point in the future. And so the model was always, okay, how can we help build this company, and in 3-7 years time try and exit? And what ends up happening is, who you exit to, generally they have more money, and for them to make money they need to find someone with more money, and we end up with the situation we're in, with a handful of people or a handful of companies basically owning everything, and it's a centralized model. And so the investment strategy is now, how do we support a kind of decentralized ownership model, and looking at steward ownership models where there's no desire to try and exit to somebody bigger, but to maintain ownership in the hands of the founders.
To see what does that translate in. It's such a moving the amount of philanthropic capital that is invested in all the things that we are all fighting against is enormous, and to understand how we begin that shift in ways that are realistic, I think it's really important. So thank you. I appreciate that quite a lot. And Lynn and Eleanor, I'd love to hear from you as well. I think, Lynn, you coming from former philanthropic advisor turned into mega change maker, and also Eleanor, first a little bit of how do you keep deepening that sense of self-reflection? Like, what are the practices? What have you changed in your lives to allow for those moments to happen? And then how have they evolved the work that you do? And again, I also know you do very practical work advising philanthropic institutions. So yeah, I'd love to hear what that looks like in practice.
When you first asked the question, I just kind of listened for what was coming. And two things came first, and then we'll see what goes with that, which is one, just in terms of a very kind of way that I live my life, is I don't sit in the echo chambers, meaning I'm not always sitting with people who agree with me or have the same ontological view with me or have the same cosmology. I'm actively sitting with in deep relational lines with people who have very different ideologies across the political spectrum, across the, what I would say, various spiritual traditions. And it feels really important to do that constantly and check whether I'm in judgment, reaction, resistance, and just how to stay centered and in a place of listening. And that's, Eleanor and I often talk about the work that we do being kind of the spiritual and political praxis. And so this is the second piece for me. There has been a fierce commitment to find a wisdom tradition that gives an octave, that gives the foundation with which all the work then comes from. So these days, I would say I'm a devotional non-dualist. I'm starting with the recognition that I still don't grok the depth of what the non-dual tradition actually offers. So I'm starting with the understanding of duality into the non-dual. And and I want to say that there's a lot of attention now on the inner and the outer. And what I'm seeing, there was a recent podcast that many may have heard, like the revolution will not be psychologized or something, but it was pointing out where the Western Occidental mind and the nature, I mean, I'm not a trained psychologist, so I can't speak to this. I was trained as I would say an ologist, sociologist, to like all these complex systems of social movements. But what I've observed of that path is that we do this inner and outer work, but it becomes a place where our ego says, until I feel certain, secure, something, I can't move. And so there the practice becomes letting go of certainty, letting go of comfort, letting go of, and the addiction to knowing the addiction to the problems and solutions. And so when we actively are doing that work every day within our institutions, within whatever, something else opens. So some of you who came on early may have seen, Eleanor and I had a pipe. We've been initiated into a tradition where there's a prayer pipe. This isn't as a white woman who's incarnated to exploit or take a practice from the Amazon, but it's to slow myself down enough to listen, to say, what is it beyond the rehearsed words or the ideas of knowing something that wants to actually come through, and really trust that place, as awkward and messy and nonlinear as it may be. And that's not just to focus on the individual self, but it's to do that even when you're holding groups and going through some of the work that Eleanor and I do. I would say we would call it applying ontological shifts, like actual praxis that supports us to dismantle what we think we know, to actually let go of knowledge so learning can actually happen. And in that way, it's continuing to listen at the most subtle level for what's knocking at the door that wants to come through, whether it's the ancestors, whether it's the wind, whether there's a real knowing, yes, it's still mine to work on degrowth in these ways, but it's not coming from the habituated patterns of mind and certainty. And the last thing I'll just say right now, it's a constant, subtle commitment to undoing transactional relationships at all the levels that it comes in, whether it be the way that we feel like, okay, let me go meet this person because they have blah, blah, blah. I've just transactionalized them. Whether it's, I'm thirsty, so let me just go grab this cup of water. But in that moment, do I actually recognize and can I see the sets of relationships that are going on in just that moment? And I'll leave it to Eleanor to add more on how he responds to this inquiry. I would say, yeah, a deep commitment to seeing life lived as prayer and ceremony.
Thank you.
There's a line in our book that says, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you're creatively and spiritually impoverished. And that's a big part of our work, is like, we have to have a critique of the dominant culture. We have to understand how it works. We have to be good students of our culture, or we don't know what we're navigating out of. And so Lynn talked about transactionalization and commodification, and that becomes a spiritual practice. So when you understand the source code of the dominant culture is based on commodification, then there's this active commitment to create embodied cultures outside of commodification, right? So the first part of that is in some ways a direct salvo to the new age who want to bypass the critique aspect. But then the second part of that is if all you have is a critique, you're creatively and spiritually impoverished, is, I guess, in that way, a direct salvo to the left, which stays in critique. And part of what we're trying to do is create embodied cultures of practice. There's an old Vedic line that says, one's work should never exceed one's practice. And the work of this time is immense. You know, we have maybe 10, 20 years left of the Western way of living at our current trajectory. Like, we have no idea what kind of collapse and breakdown and renewal that we're being prepared for. And in some ways, the deepening of the practice, and I mean practice in the most broad spectrum sense of it, from morning sadhana and like the literal practice to the presence and awareness of breath, to how we are with every material interaction, like that becomes the work to do. And you know, preparation for death, and in contemplation of death. And, you know, as Carlos Castaneda used to say, live with death as your advisor, because that ends up shifting the energetic field of who and how you're interacting with, right? Because again, our culture is a death phobic culture, and it's a present phobic culture. And so when you understand that, in some ways it becomes easier to shift. You just have to look at what the dominant culture is doing and then do the opposite. And just part of my practice has been, especially around money, when we closed the rules, this economic alternatives think tank and activist collective in 2019, it was only going to live 8 years before we started TRC, because we didn't know what we were going to do. I took 17 months sabbatical, but my sabbatical was not a work sabbatical, it was a money sabbatical. So I had no income and I had no savings. And I decided all I would do is I'd create an altar to the mother and ask how I'd be in service to divine unfolding. And I visited that altar twice a day, and I decided to make no decisions and take no money for that 17-month period. And, you know, I have the privilege of living in a community where I don't pay rent. We collectively own this land. We grow our own food. And so, you know, you just don't go to the dentist and the physiotherapist, and I don't own a car, or I didn't at the time. And that practice actually really helped me in my ability to then work in the field of philanthropy. And when we talk practicality, even this distinction between what's practical and not, I find problematic. You know, the least practical work I do is working with funders. And the most important work I still do is working with social movements and people actually organizing their voice in bioregions and, you know, the front lines of struggle against capitalist modernity. But also the most practical work we can do is to be connected to our prayer. And I don't mean prayer in the Abrahamic sense, in the Judeo-Christian sense of asking some benevolent white-bearded God for bounty. I mean it in the sense of being in dialogue with the living animate planet, including our own bodies as fractal aspects of that ecosystem.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. And again, as we had many conversations in preparation for this webinar, I think we want it to be challenged, right? So the whole thing is also to challenge these ideas of, you know, we were talking about bringing things into practice. And I know I'm a person that I like doing. So I'm hyperactive. I have ADHD as well. So I'm constantly doing. And I think that idea of like living life as a prayer, and that is your practice, I also find it really interesting. So yeah, thank you for all the so which brings us to a really interesting place, because when we were preparing this webinar, we also wanted to, we're talking a lot of this, you know, big and deep subjects, but we also wanted to talk about some of the frameworks that you have in the book that helps people navigate a lot of those questions, a lot of those contradictions. So we talked before about talking about the mandala that you have in the book, and we actually have that image. And I'd love to do that work now, where you can speak through the mandala, and then me and Seth, we're going to work through some contradictions and see how can we actually take, like, philanthropy has a lot of contradictions, So how can we take some of those and see what the perspective would be like within a post-capitalist philanthropy system or framework? So yeah, I don't know if you want to share, Renata, and I'd love Lynn and Onur. It's difficult, but I think this is walking through some of the aspects of post-capitalist philanthropy that you can share with us.
Lynn, do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with just a few pieces of this idea of post-capitalism. We want to just say a few things about that, and which is that we're not invoking post-capitalism as the next thing that comes. We're not invoking kind of linear temporality of old culture, new culture. We're referring to post-capitalism in a way that the postmodernists were referring to that as something that is informed by the conditions of capitalism. And so this is where Alnor was speaking to that, if you have a critique, you're spiritually impoverished. But if you don't actually have a critique, you're kind of irrelevant in these moments. You're kind of stuck in your own navel gazing of my enlightenment, my awakening. And so the other piece to say when we speak about post-capitalism is we're referring to a plurality of shift of, you could say, values or states of beings, such as interdependence, cooperation over competition, solidarity with life, nonviolence, compassion, a whole other set of ways that we're invoking within this post-capitalism. And then the third piece, which we'll get into when we speak to this mandala specifically, is to recognize that while we may all be feeling collapse in this kind of existential moment of the end of the way of the Western way, the Occidental way of living over, we could have long discussions, whether it's 500 years, this couple thousand years, or where we are in the Kali Yuga or the Anthropocene. There are others around this planet who have lived post-capitalist realities for a very long time, indeed since first contact, often with colonial settlers who kind of destroyed their entire way of living, of seeing, and yet there is a post-capitalist vibration and way of living that has endured. So that's the first thing to say. The second piece is that we go through a line of inquiry in the book that says we're moving out of what we call neoliberalism or late stage capitalist modernity. You could use any of these terms that lock us into what Alnor referred to earlier as the holy untrinity of materialism, separatism, and positivism. And we're offering a provocation of spiral logic, starting to see ourselves as an interconnected web and philanthropy in that spiral logic is, we could recast it as a web of social ecologies in a biome. So it's seeing itself not as a separate institution with cultures, but in response and in dialogue with place, with peoples, with all of the work that it's doing. It's inextricably entangled and linked with. So as we speak through this mandala, the reason I offer that is because it's not just what you do. This will give one pass of this will say how you might move resources in a different way, but there's a deeper thing that we're constantly invoking, which is what is the manner by which you're approaching this? What is the way that you're being? What is the praxis that is working, the ontological shifts that we keep invoking that goes hand in hand with this, what shall we do? Alnor, do you want to say anything else to introduce it?
No, we can go into the content of it.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So Lynn gave some of the texture around the 5 elements mandala, and just to orient you around the visual. So there's this, it's a mandala, so it's not axis, it's not quadrants, but the vertical line of transformation and creation, at the bottom of that is earth. And this is about how do we use capital to build post-capitalist infrastructure? Land, food, water, energy, medicine, cultural, communal sovereignty at a bioregional level. Bioregions are what makes sense in terms of where forests begin and end, where rivers begin and end, where biomes begin and end, and that there will be a move to local governance, whether we like it or not, right? Climate change is going to force us to live in small localized communities, and we have a moment, a very short window to build that infrastructure now. And if we try to do that, post 2-3 degree rise in temperature, etc., it's going to be very dystopic. And there's a lens on bodies of culture and indigenous peoples and others that have had unbroken symbiotic lines with their living geographies to be supported in doing that work. So that's the bottom element that grounds this earth. And at the top of this vertical axis is the element of air, which is about creating new, ancient, emerging cultural contexts. So this is the realm of ideas. This is the realm of narrative work, of artists, of culture hacking, of media, that we have to also simultaneously shift the very discourse and the intellectual, spiritual, cognitive, emotional context in which these ideas are being discussed. And a lot of beautiful and important work is happening in that space. And of course, in our authoritarianism and rationalism and traditionalism and nationalism and fascism is the fact that regressive forces are better at this work in some ways, in many ways. I think that's up for discussion and debate, but that's the sense, is that this is critically important strategic territory on the spiritual political chessboard. Then if we look at the horizontal lens, this is about restoration solidarity. And so to the left, we have water, the tributaries of Pachamama, which is indigenous peoples and the work they're doing across the world and in stewarding biodiversity, biomes, medicines, cultural practices, and sanity in the face of colonial onslaught. And to also say that, colonialism is not a thing that happened, right? We're in the midst of ongoing coloniality. And this work is necessary, it needs to be supported, and there's also a delicacy to doing it. It's not the imposition of the Western will or funder will. And then on the right is fire, which is solidarity with social movements, historically marginalized peoples organizing themselves in place for land sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, food sovereignty, etc., in the face of quote unquote development. And then the center is ether, which is, we call it the recultivation of life force. But in some ways, it's the, Lynn often talks about, in alchemy, this is the precondition, the state change. So it's not that one of these things happens in sequence, but actually we have to continually be tending the ether, that healing and restoration is required not only in the activist space. Our dear friend Bayo Akomolafe often says, part of the crisis is the way we're responding to the crisis as activists. And so that healing work, that repair work, that restoration work, the neoliberal term of self-care or communal care, this needs to be funded, this needs to be tended to. And there's lots of implications what this means for funders, but that's the through line. But also, it's also true for the funders. Right. And there's this idea of the kind of hero worship, and somehow the funders, it's very neoliberal, right? That if someone has resources, there must be somehow more worthy or evolved or what have you. And they're often not well spiritually, definitely from a familial context, right? There's spiritual karmic implications to holding money. And most people don't want to talk about those implications. And so there's also recultivation of life force that needs to happen in the funder space, and also bringing funders and activists together to have this open dialogue about how do we get to a space beyond commodification, beyond transactionalization, beyond reparations. There's something more that wants to be created, and it requires attunement and a sensitivity that we don't know yet what that looks like. So that's just a sense, and I don't know, Lynn, if you want to add to that.
I think the piece I would add is that piece of ether, or that recultivation of life force, is some may hear others speaking about animism or other ways of being and knowing. This is the central condition of kind of getting out of the habituated Occidental mind that sees everything as parts to whole, that says, I need to know the solution. I need to understand the problem before I can act. And it's really entering that space of queering. It's beyond the binaries, and it's a gateway in that recognizes that we as human species have somehow imagined ourselves separate from the living cosmos. And it's a gateway in where others who are speaking of like, where's the crack right now for something else to come through. So we see this ether as a central piece. And this is a mandala because it's an inner and an outer journey. Again, this is both a spiritual, political kind of map for how do we approach and what might be some provocations for how we respond. And perhaps the last thing to say is that anytime you put up a framework, there's of course limitations. And this is our subjective view that came through dialogue with many, that came through dialogues with the plants, that came through the dialogue with the more than human of what can we offer. And the last thing I'll say is, as a woman who in this lifetime incarnated as a cisgender woman living, I was born in the US. This work of solidarity is very deep work. It's not to self-assert, it's actually to decondition, to actually find what right relationship and relationality is with place, with peoples of place, with movements where the world's majority are, and then to listen from that place of ether for how do we use capital to build post-capitalist infrastructure in these times and come up with other cultural narratives. So we're not caught in the old cliche of we can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine a world without capitalism. And I'll leave it there.
We wanted to bring this idea of contradictions, and then I'll invite Seth, but everyone as well, to think about this. I often think the paradoxes or the contradictions sometimes represents that crack that you just mentioned, where we can bring some awareness to that helps us shift the way we're thinking. And as I mentioned earlier, like, I think there are so many contradictions in this work and so many contradictions in philanthropy and capitalism. And I'd love everyone to reflect a little bit. What are some of the contradictions that you're facing in your own work that have to do with the power of money and how we're using money? And feel free to have a reflection, write those contradictions in the chat. If we have time, I'll pick a few for us to unpick. But I'd love to start with you, Seth. I also have some of my own. But yeah, I'd love to start with you, Seth. What is, like, you've been doing this practice, you've been, growing your awareness and your connection to nature and to the voices of the more than human. And you're bringing that into the work of the foundation. But I'm sure there's plenty of contradictions left, or plenty of opportunities that you're seeing of how you can, grow yourself into the work so it can keep evolving. So I'd love to start with your reflections on this.
I mean, I almost feel it's hard to find anything we're doing that isn't a contradiction, to be honest. I mean, maybe just starting with the fact that I get invited to speak at things by the pure fact that I have wealth is recreating the paradigm that we're trying to move out of. And, money is a very powerful currency. Even the title of this talk is about flowing money, and yet, on some level, we're trying to move towards systems that are post-capitalist and where the role of money is far less powerful than it is today. I'm still having conversations with people all the time in the impact investment world that are trying to prove that you can make, market returns and have a positive impact at the same time. And why are they doing that? It's to speak to the power of money and that, the profit maximization type model, and saying we can still do that and do something that's good at the same time. And I guess, on a really practical basis, like what I'm sat with a lot of the time is I really have this strong belief that, to solve the inequality crisis, that means, which I represent, you know, I'm a white man in central London who has wealth in the 1% group. I am the problem. In order to change that, the only way I can do it is by giving my money away, and essentially being out of the 1%. And that is the only way I believe that one can actually reduce inequality, not investing and making a 10 to 15% return in an impact in a inequality fund. Like, that's just not going to cut it. And even though I know that that's the direction that I believe we have to go, the challenge is, by spending down, you know, it's a journey of having less money and less influence in some ways. And so that's really the question that I'm sat with, as, you know, there's a, I feel like I have a voice that needs to be shared sometimes, or just these questions brought up. And yet, like, there's an insecurity of, like, if I had nothing, would I be invited into this space? And so it's like, what does that journey look like to go on, to essentially spend down and have nothing? Is it a political action to do that? Is it, does it work doing it alone? So that's kind of some of the conflicts that I'm sat with, and really, I don't know the answer to, but it's the direction. And there's something in me that's like, spending down, but not like, you know, overnight. It's a transition, and that's how I justify it to myself. And yet I know that that's where we ultimately need to go, and people in my position have to do the same thing.
So, you know, in the Transition Resource Circle, how would you deal with such inquiry? Because I think it's an important one, because it has to do with power. And yeah, even for me also, like, I keep thinking, the fact that I work for Lush and we're also a funder opens so many doors that I would not have opened if I weren't in this position. So yeah, I'd love to hear from and also someone put it in the chat, and I think it also has to do with what Seth was saying, this concept of true solidarity versus charity, right? Or spending down while actually redistributing wealth, right? How do you navigate that? It's a huge contradiction. Like, how do you navigate that through the framework and the work that you do?
You want me to start then? I think we first have to start with reframing the kind of Occidental dualistic binary notion of, like, contradiction equals bad, right? That all there is contradiction. Like, living in the Anthropocene, living in the Kali Yuga, living in the Dark Ages, the very fact that we have incarnated in separate bodies, and from a mystical perspective, there's only one of us here having a distributed spiritual cognitive experience, is quote unquote contradiction. But that's reality as it is. And so you have to embrace reality as it is. And contradiction, like paradox, what it's good for is to break you open. And that's the starting place, is to really sit with it, to let it have its way with you, to be so overwhelmed by the grief of the insanity of living in a death culture that something else is born of it. This kind of leftist idea that we're going to move from some form of charity to justice, some form of inequality to equity, defined by what, in what terms, right? And the desire for that creates new fascists and creates this flattening of the biodiversity of what it is to be human. And in some ways, what I think is being asked of us is to put our head to the soil and ask the living earth what she needs from us, and then to also be embedded within community and be accountable to other people, where you say, I've inherited this money that I do not deserve, that does not belong to me, that's the world's collective wealth, but no matter how strategic I am with this money, it is not going to change the outcome of what happens. That is a very difficult thing to admit. if we just look at all of philanthropy together, it's $2 to $3 trillion. That's not even that's like 1/3 or something of the Pentagon's budget. So it's like the scale of this thing is never going to be commensurate, right? This desire for certainty, for solving the problem, for rushing to some post-capitalist reality. Something else is being asked of us, and it requires our individual surrender, our individual deep spiritual practice, and it's only going to happen in relationality with other people. It's only going to happen in relationality with the animate earth and the living cosmos, and the human and more than human realms that will hold us accountable to what is our enteleki. Enteleki is this Greek word, like within it, it knows its own telos, its own telios, its own purpose. And tapping that enteleki into the Gaian enteleki, which has its own agency and its own will and its own directionality. We've just hijacked our ability to stream into that through the over development and the imposition of the Western will and the ego.
Thank you. Lynn, would you like to add anything?
I don't even know if there's anything to add after the beautiful pieces. Maybe I'll just speak to two things here. When Alnor and I were, or I would almost say this book was writing us or something, we started it with a series of paradoxes. And so I just want to be explicit that we're actively invoking this paradox of use capital to liberate capital at the service of life. So just to lay that out there, recognizing. And then the other piece with what Alnor was sharing, and also what Seth said, every wisdom tradition teaches to embrace contradiction, to embrace paradox. And within there, without the knowing, but there something cracks through. And so perhaps I'll just leave this provocation that I'm sitting deeply with is, we sit here in Central America that has a very deep, rich history of what happened in the 60s of liberation theology. And it was a time where the Jesuit priests said, we are not going to proselytize. We're not going to do the missionary work. We're actively going to embrace the spiritual political praxis in service of justice, in service of liberation. And I'll just, if you're not familiar with this, many are, but this gave rise to movements that had durability and lasting power, and were a time that the geopolitical South influenced even the Brentwood institutions and so forth and so on. And so I sit with an active question continually of what are the liberation ontologies of our times? What is it? What's the modern day equivalent of the priest? I think it's our addiction to being the ones that are working in problem and solution in our sectors. And it's actively disrupting our pattern to evangelize whatever it is, and to say, I'm going to embrace the spiritual political praxis. I'm going to do this inner work that allows for a shift of the very gaze and the way that I see reality. And I'm going to listen to the more than human. I'm going to listen to the living cosmos to find what is mine to do. And I don't mean it as an individual separate self. I mean to actually sow the seeds and find what is the liberation ontology of our times. So I'll leave it there.
About all of this is actually that, as funders or movements, we have, even if the relationship in philanthropy is transactional, we are in relationship with people. We are in relationship with grantees, often in the global South, often that are coming from different cultures. And I think to practice the deep listening within the work is also, for me, like a key nodal intervention of shifting our awareness is by actually listening to the people that we aim to be in solidarity with. And we have those access. We have access to that. We have access to those relationships as funders. So for me, that's what came up as a good place to start this work. Yeah. But thank you. Yeah, it's all really deep and really interesting. And Seth, I wanted to know if listening to this caused any thoughts to arise in you, or any further comments, and then I'm going to open for questions.
Yeah, I love what was being shared, and as I said at the beginning, it's like, what isn't a contradiction? And yeah, I mean, all of life is an opportunity for our spiritual selves in our human bodies to learn and grow. And I don't believe we're gonna ever solve anything, but it's a journey. I mean, I'd be really curious. I mean, even in this conversation, what I find interesting is like, there's 4 people that are having a conversation, but actually there's a much bigger collective and a bigger collective intelligence. And what are the formats that are available to us to bring all of that wisdom into the space? And it's like, what are the limitations that exist within the ways that we operate? I'm going tomorrow to give a talk in London, and there's like 400 people coming, and it's putting speakers on a stage, who are all privileged people, and it's like we're just replicating the same thing over and over. But as you said, hopefully it's not circles, it's spirals, and somehow that there is a natural progression to all of this that is somehow guiding us. And because we are nature, we're always being guided by nature.
Thank you so much. And my last question before I open, we start with the closing, is Lynn and Onur. I think when we were preparing for the webinar, I also thought it was important to end in a way that, so if I'm moved by this conversation, where do I start? What is, we talked about like life bringing our practice, and and having this capacity to listen. So yeah, what would you advise or suggest or hope for people can do to start moving in that direction of connecting to those ontologies, of bringing this practice into their work?
Do you want to go? I think probably that my instinct is to say contemplation and slowing down in the midst of the madness. The old African proverb, the times are urgent, we must slow down. If people are interested in the materials in the book, there's a free webinar series you can look up. And also, this might be a good moment to plug Renata, to bring her in, to say, come to the gathering that we're going to do in the UK as well at 42 Acres, and we will deepen our practice together.
Yeah, I was going to offer
Renata.
I was going to just offer similarly. I think this is work that we need to do collectively and innerly. I'm not saying individually, I'm saying innerly and collectively. There, as Elnor said, there is a webinar series. It isn't Elnor and I speaking, but it's really other wisdom keepers who are offering various views. And there are a number of people who really offer something quite profound to these moments. And I think this is a moment to bring in Renata. We wrote this book and we offered it in a webinar, and we've been doing different, whatever it is, webinars or podcasts, but there's also, you can download a copy of it for free. There's various exercises in it, not because we have any answers. We're just opening up a line of inquiry for all of us to find our way by not finding our way in and through. So.
Retreat. Renata, do you want to invite everyone here?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing all of this. My mind and my body, like my fingers are tingling, and I just want to also create the space to listen to beyond my mind, basically, but a lot of food for thought. So for you that were here when we started this webinar, I mentioned that we have a community of practice that we've been going for 2.5 years, and alongside other things we do some in-person events. And this is going to be our next event. It is also with Eleanor and Lynn. They're going to be here in the UK, so we're going to be lucky to co-host it with them and keep exploring the theme of money in service of life. It's going to be between 24th and 27th of September at 42 Acres, which some of you I know have been already. And if you haven't, I highly recommend. It's a really special place that lives this ethos that we're speaking about. We have some early bird discounts. Hope Faith is sharing the link for the RSVP. We will send more information on the follow-up email as well. And also, if you're in Brazil, we're going to have an event by the end of October as well, which are not ready to advertise like this one. We're almost there, but feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to put my email on the chat box, and I will happily share more information.
Thank you so much. Faith, do you want to just share about next steps for the community of practice?
Yeah,
And just reinforce that?
yeah, just to say thank you again to Lynn, to Eleanor, and to Seth. This has been a very powerful conversation, and I think all of us are sitting with beautiful questions, and yeah, just hope. I think I'm leaving with hope. Just to say that we will be wrapping up with a follow-up email with the webinar, and if you're interested in joining the Trust-Based Philanthropy Community of Practice, I'll put the form link in again. If you're interested in joining us in real life, we are also hosting the 42-acre gathering, and then, as Renata said, there's another gathering in Brazil, and then there will be a follow-up gathering in the US in a couple months. So please continue to stay engaged. Yeah, just a deep vow of gratitude to Eleanor, to Lynn, to Seth, to Ruth, to Renata, and to all of you.
Just one thing I forgot to mention, sorry, it's our first time using this platform to charge tickets. So if you have any issues, which is probably likely to some of you, feel free to also write to me, and we can find our ways, other ways to get you to join us, okay? Excellent.
Thanks, everyone. Hopefully we see some of you in person, or all of you actually in person. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Seth. Yeah, for opening your heart, and Lynn and Eleanor for all the embodied wisdom, I'd say. And I can't wait for us all to be together face to face. Thank you.